Okay, welcome to another one of the Norristown Initiative's ongoing series of forums brought to you by the Norristown Initiative, and today in conjunction with the Norristown Preservation Society and Dr. Bill Wirt, president this year. Today's subject addresses Norristown's historical architecture, why we need to fight to preserve it. This is a subject that is very, very dear to my heart, and I have a very personal involvement in it. Not only have I done it as a business for the last 25 years, but it's also a very personal passion of mine. I believe that the historical architecture of Norristown is one of its greatest, if not its greatest asset, and will be a key element to its revitalization. And it is definitely one of the key elements that keeps me in Norristown. Some of the best examples of historical periods of this country's history are present here in Norristown, on streets like DeKalb, Swede, West Marshall, and Jacoby. Every time I see an historically significant building get torn down, I believe it's a crime against humanity. Every time I see a property owner tear off a corbel, a soffit, or a fascia, or some of the gingerbread and railings from the original porches, I feel pain. Where else could you go to buy buildings for as little as 10 cents on the dollar for what it would cost to reproduce these properties? When I see these structures, I see a product that is so labor intensive that it will never be built again, most likely in this country. When I see a structure that is 100 to 200 years old, I see a period in the history of this town that was its greatness, was in its greatness. And hopefully it can be a time that we can reproduce, but to do that, I think we're going to need to retain the historical structures. Through the years, I, like many of you here, have seen magnificent buildings in town torn down to make parking lots and pharmacies. This has got to stop. These buildings could help bring us back to a period when Norristown was great and when this town was in its heyday. Once these buildings are gone, they're going to be gone for good. We have to preserve these buildings and work at ways to adopt them to the needs of our present society. I personally have participated in providing that asset back into the community on many occasions, and I know it can be done again in many other places. Now, our speakers today will be Dr. Ward from the Norristown Preservation Society and Amy Wolt. Did I say that right? Okay. She is here today from the Norristown Preservation Society of Reading. They have their own department that just addresses historical preservation for the town. Next to her is Michael Stevens. He is president of the Norristown Association of Investment Landlords. And at the end, we have Michel Lefebvre. He is from the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission. So now I will pass the floor on to Dr. Ward.
Thank you. Real estate people have a term they use to describe how immediately saleable a house is. They call it curb appeal. What this is just what a place looks like as you drive up to the curb and glance out the car window. It's really important to the sale of a house. It's perhaps the most important part of the sale of a private house, except perhaps the neighborhood, which is sort of a larger version of curb appeal. Well, I have to say, Norristown doesn't have much in the way of curb appeal. Norristown's curb appeal over the last couple of decades has been just completely shot. Our downtown looks terrible. It looks, as I've said before, like the South Bronx did before they started the renovations. We really need to do something. If we don't do something soon, there'll be nothing here left. We have got to get on the stick here and get moving on preserving Norristown and saving it so there's something worth preserving. Another decade will be too late. Now, there are a lot of arguments against the idea of having a HARB, an Historic Architectural Review Board, and you're probably going to be hearing some of them very soon, since this issue is going to be discussed in quite some depth, I think. And I'd like to take a moment to rebut some of these arguments. One argument that's going to be made, no doubt, is that we don't need a HARB because we already have the Secretary of the Interior standards. These are standards promulgated by the federal government. The intention of these standards is in certain areas to preserve historic architecture. Well, historically in Norristown, pardon the pun, these standards have been ignored. These standards really only affect programs which have state or federal funding. But the main problem with these standards is there's really no oversight unless a program has essentially appointed a board to oversee them, or an architect who's really interested in overseeing them. So we have a lot of programs in Norristown which over the years, although they're federal programs, have actually been very destructive to the historic fabric of the town. For example, the county's weatherization program, which is state funded, has mandated the removal of historic windows from many buildings in town and replacement with aluminum. Code enforcement officers frequently, if they find a loose baluster on a porch, request or demand that the entire baluster or balustrade be replaced. And what it's usually replaced with is what I call the tobacco road look, pressure treated lumber. So we really need something beyond the Secretary of the Interior standards, which is really going to be enforced. Another argument that's going to be made is that we don't need a HARB because we have the enterprise zone and its attendant design review committee. Well, the enterprise zone does not really cover the historic districts of Norristown. There's a little bit of overlap, but mostly the enterprise zone is in areas which are not in the historic districts. Secondly, the enterprise zone concept is geared to new development. And the Preservation Society doesn't really have a problem with this because almost all of downtown Norristown has been demolished. But most important probably is that despite the fact that there's a design review committee, there are no preservationists or even historically knowledgeable people on the design review committee. The Preservation Society agitated for the appointment of someone from its own group, or at least someone historically knowledgeable. And the people in charge of selecting the members of that committee just stonewalled. They refused to appoint anybody. They did make an attempt to appoint someone they thought that they could perhaps influence his decisions, but eventually even he decided that it wasn't worth the hassle. Then another argument we're going to hear is that we don't need a HARB because we have the facade improvement program, which is about to be greatly expanded in the sense that there's going to be money available, large amounts of money available, or at least a larger amount of money available, and that this program is going to be available to all building owners rather than simply commercial owners. Well, the old facade improvement program, which incidentally is partly federally funded, has a very poor history of adhering to the Secretary of the Interior standards. In fact, it is largely responsible, I think, for the way downtown Norristown looks. Although I don't believe that they've actually used any facade improvement grants for demolition. They, however, did use facade improvement grant monies for improvement of vacant lots into parking lots. There's no historic oversight of the facade improvement program. There's no board that reviews the kind of design changes that are going to be made or constructional changes to be made. The new program is going to be a very small area. It's going to concentrate, at least initially, on West Marshall Street. And at that, only a few blocks, not all of West Marshall Street. No program, or program monies are only going to be spent on things supposedly that are historically appropriate, but that doesn't stop the owner from doing things that are not historically appropriate in the same renovation. So we'll see the actual money spent, say, for example, on painting the porch while the owner removes the historic windows. And there's always the question of how it's going to be enforced. In the past, the monies in Norristown have frequently just been handed over, and there's really been no follow-up. And for all of the above programs, none of those programs cover private work, which is the majority of the work done in Norristown. Many building owners don't feel it's worth the hassle to deal with these programs, like the facade improvement program, or that many of them don't feel that it's financially remunerative for them because they have to do the work at prevailing wage. So the large landowners are not likely to even engage in that. Another argument is that business owners won't like it. And if that's the case, one has to ask why they targeted for the facade improvement program the blocks of West Marshall, which are commercial. The truth is that some business owners will like it and some don't. At a recent meeting of the GNC, there was some agitation of GNC members who finally see that something has to be done with Norristown. Something has to be done with the way it looks. Not all of the members agreed, and maybe they haven't hashed this out amongst themselves, but many business owners in Norristown realize that something simply has to be done. It looks like hell. Now, the proposal we're going to be making for the Harb is that it cover the historic districts. And the historic districts don't really cover most of Main Street. Only a small portion of downtown Norristown is covered by the historic district. And for better or for worse, this pretty much nullifies the argument that business owners don't like it. And perhaps the last argument I think we're likely to hear is that developers won't like it. That we won't get any developers in Norristown if we have a Harb. And you know, maybe this is a little bit of a chicken and the egg question, but, or maybe having a Harb is a little like the high school girl who refuses in advance to go to the prom and is deluged with offers. But it seems to me that it's the towns that have a Harb that have to beat off developers with a stick. If you look at the towns around Norristown that have a Harb, all of them have more development than they can handle. And all I can say is that the developers are sensitive, just like homeowners, to what a place looks like. They're very sensitive to curb appeal. They want a place that looks decent. They're not going to move into a slum. They need a place that looks good. Let's try to make Norristown look good. Thank you.
Before I go on to our next speaker, I was a little remiss in my duties. I forgot to welcome some of our council people who are present here today, who actually are here on a regular basis. Marge Hunsinger, who's president of council, Olivia Brady, vice president, Michelle Griffin Colbrith. Department, your economic development? Finance, excuse me. Finance, and we also have Doug Seiler present today, president of GNC, and Mary Ellen DiGregorio, who is president of the Homeowners Association. So now, next speaker will be Amy Wolt of the Historic Preservation. No, you are an Historic Preservationist Specialist.
Specialist, City of Reading, yes. And therefore, I'm also the staff person to Reading Harb. This morning, I just wanted to give you kind of a basic run-through of our Harb process. The City of Reading has 3 historic districts. The Callow Hill Historic District is a commercial district that was established in 1979, and these are local districts, they're not National Register districts. The Prince District was established in 1982 and is both commercial and residential in character. And the Center Park Historic District is residential primarily, and it was also established in 1982. All of the districts are governed, of course, by the Harb and our historic district ordinance. The basic Harb process begins when a property owner or a contractor for the property owner comes to our city codes office, hopefully, to pull a building permit, and they recognize that they're in a historic district and you send them to see me. Or it also happens just through property owners making an inquiry, they recognize that they're in a historic district and want to make improvements to their properties. I determine whether the proposal should go before the Harb, or if I'm authorized to actually approve the work to be done. Basically, our Harb reviews anything that can be seen from a public right-of-way. So that can mean a rear alley, whether it be vehicular or a foot alley, and of course from the main roadway. I, as staff, am authorized to approve repairs or things that are done to a property in kind, meaning you're making repairs to match exactly what's there. If you're replacing trim or molding on your home, exactly as what's there, I can approve that. I can also approve paint colors, and there's couple of other property has to go before our review board. They fill out what's called a certificate of appropriateness application, and it's a basic owner information and what the proposed project is going to be. Since we have 3 large districts, there are over 800 properties, I think, in each of them. I deal with all sorts of things from major signage on commercial storefronts to people wanting to change the front door of their property. Our HARB meets every 3rd Tuesday of the month, and as stated in our ordinance, the HARB is made up of 11 members. We have an architect, a real estate agent, and a person that is knowledgeable in building trades. Also, we have 1 member from each that either owns property or lives in one of the districts, and then the remaining 5 members are persons of general knowledge or interested in preserving historic properties. Over the years, we've developed what's called an executive committee that meets actually the week before our formal meeting, kind of go over projects and make sure we have all the information. And it also is a help because at that time, if there's recommendations, like for instance on a sign, if there's too much wordage or something, I can go back to the applicant and say, hey, you might want to think about this. So we have several things in place to get people through the process as easily as possible and hopefully painless as possible. The HARB then, of course, approves or denies the application. If an application is denied, the applicant has the ability to go before our city council and appeal the decision. In 1999, we changed our ordinance to better benefit the property owners. Our original ordinance had in place a system where the board, the HARB, would recommend our resolutions or recommend their decision to our city council, and therefore city council was responsible for reviewing each and every proposal. And this sometimes made the property owner wait 2 weeks because our meetings weren't in sync. So we revised our ordinance to mandate that the HARB actually has the final approval, of course, on proposals, and therefore then the property owner or contractor can come in the very next day and pull a building permit, so there isn't that 2-week waiting period. It made it quicker and easier. However, of course, council still wanted to have some control, and therefore they do review demolitions, which is also a benefit to the HARB, because the HARB, using the Secretary of Interior guidelines, really isn't, it's not their purview to approve a demolition, and therefore the applicant would have to go before council, and it would really be council's decision, and they can look at it more of an economic standpoint. Also, council reviews any construction of any small structures exceeding 20 square feet, so that can be a small garage or shed, a small structure. Also, building additions and changes in building height or roof lines. So basically major structural changes they're responsible for approving also. Also, the board, besides our historic district ordinance, over the years they've developed policies as they saw necessary regarding signage, demolition, window replacement, and we also have a fence policy. And we're in the process of revisiting some of these because it's a case-by-case business or case-by-case thing. If you get to the HARB meeting and the HARB members are faced with something new all the time and say, hey, maybe we should talk about this in our policy, our sign policy, or what have you. So we are in the process of revising some of those policies. We also have a facade improvement program in the city of Reading, and I believe it was about 5 years ago, they enacted a facade improvement program, a residential program, in our Center Park Historic District, and it's a really good tool, and it's actually more popular than our commercial facade improvement program, which is primarily our central business district. We've had a lot of successes with the residential program, just because it's another thing I can offer to a property owner who may be in opposition that they can't change their railing or what have you. I had one instance, for example, of a property owner wanted to replace his balustrade. It was in very bad disrepair. He wanted to just put up a basic wrought iron railing. He had all the spindles to the balustrade in his basement, and I said to him, and through the board, we worked with him, and said you can use the facade improvement program to restore those spindles, have new ones turned, restore the balustrade completely, and he did it, and we saved a piece of our architectural history. So we've had a lot of good things happen in that program in our residential district. That's pretty much it. That's the basic process. Of course, with everything, there's opposition, and I just try to instill in our applicants that our board is made up of professionals, design professionals, and we're there to work with them and come out with the best possible outcome to preserve our architecture.
Thank you very much, Amy. Now, before we go on to our next speaker, another brief announcement. This Tuesday, 23rd, Borough Hall, 7:30. It is 7:30? Okay, there will be a HARB workshop, and I believe Michelle Lefebvre will be there also. Is that correct, Michelle? Okay, and it's being conducted by our Borough Council. Okay, now we turn to Michael Stevens, President of the Norristown Association of Investment Landlords. Michael?
Good morning, everyone. I find myself here in the undesirable probably being the devil's advocate. But before I jump into that role, I just want to preface to say that I'm a longtime resident of Norristown. I live in a beautiful old home. I like an old home. I grew up in King of Prussia. Will never live in a tract house again. But I sit here and I'm all in favor of the HARB, but our situation in Norristown, I think we need to proceed with a little bit of caution. I'm a landlord. I own several properties. I have a lot of experience. I've rehabbed 5 different houses. I do have some experience there. I'm also very educated in the situation of lead paint, which I think will really start to tie into this. Right now, we have a depressed housing market, and we need to proceed with caution. If we jump into this too heavy, you may end up with people not wanting to buy houses, not being able to afford to fix the houses up to the proper specs of how you would want it in a historical manner. There's things you may want to look at, like facade work, things that are definitely going to be noticeable. I know in my own house, I have nothing is capped. I have no vinyl siding on the facade. I have kept the original windows. But as far as, when you get into a situation of, say, rental properties, you run into a position of lead paint, which is a big issue. If you talk to anyone who does lead paint abatement, the first thing they'll tell you is to A, remove it, B, cover it. Unfortunately, that gets into a lot of the aluminum capping, which solves the problem of separating people from the lead paint. With the windows, the first thing they're going to tell you is just take out the windows. At doors as well, they're going to tell you to replace them. As far as lead paint abatement goes, it's extremely expensive to get lead paint abated from wood. So we really need to look at a balance. Again, with the curb appeal, Dr. Ward mentioned, is very important. Matter of fact, just this week, I'm planning a project. I own two adjoining houses that have the Tobacco Road look on the porch, which I do not like, and I want to upgrade that. And I'm trying to consider, what my options are, what I can afford. I'd love to get into make it a beautiful, ballasted porch. I don't know if that's in the budget, but again, when there's money available, matching money to do that, that really makes an incentive and just makes it more feasible to do it as well. As I was planning this project, somebody was rehabbing a house right down the street that had unbelievable, beautiful, beautiful gingerbread around the porch. I stood there and watched them take a hammer to it, and it obviously was not in bad shape. They put a lot of work into getting that off. As a matter of fact, it was in such bad shape, sometimes you get a condition where the paint's so bad, it's very easy to remove. You can practically blow on it and it comes up. And that was the situation. It's just a shame that they were just tearing down all this great gingerbread. It would not have cost them a whole lot of money to actually bring this up to par. So to put things in line like that, to keep people from doing that, to keep people from unnecessarily stuccoing over brick, or even worse, putting vinyl siding over brick, is just a great idea. But we do have to keep in mind that, you know, right now we are in a situation where we're not in a good housing market. When things improve, it would be a great idea, you know, to up the level. You know, when you can get more for your house, you can put more into your house. But you know, I just want to exercise caution there, and we don't want to go too far too quickly with that. But we definitely need to do something to make the town look better. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. To add a little comment in support of what Michael says, and I guess this is why I say I approach the historical properties in Norristown with passion, because economically, at least at this time, it's not rewarding. The abatement process that he's speaking of for lead, I've actually personally done on several properties. I've literally taken all the corbels off, taken the doors out, taken the windows out, had them dipped, stripped, sanded, repainted. And believe me, it's a very expensive process. You have to love it to do it. But we do have a challenge ahead of us. And I'm hoping that someday in the future that these painstaking processes will be rewarded. I believe they will be, and I'm hoping that a lot more people do also. So, I'm not quite sure which way to go here. Normally we take a midterm break, but Michelle, I believe, is going to be our primary speaker here. Michelle, do you want to start speaking now and break somewhere halfway through, or do you want to?
It's up to you. I don't think we need a break. Keep going.
Okay, we'll go right into it. Michelle?
Thank you. I like to stand. I like to move. Well, historic preservation. You know, when I think about the problems faced by Norristown or Reading or Lancaster. Oh, thank you for that. I thought it was a French national anthem there for a second. I don't think it is. It's Swiss, okay. When I think about these various cities that I've experienced, and I was a preservation officer for the city of Reading for 11 years, and was part of the whole development of that preservation approach. You know, I think about, I have a comprehensive view. I want to take a look at it in a comprehensive way. Preservation, the preservation approach of which you've been speaking about, preserving the exterior character of the houses and whatnot, and their various features. That preservation approach is a tool among many other tools that a municipality would use to maintain, preserve, sustain itself, improve itself. It's just one of the tools. If you only use one tool, you're probably not going to be able to get to where you want to go, to mix metaphors here. If you use one tool, it may not be enough in order to create what you want to create, what you want to construct. And you want to construct a healthy, vibrant, economically, socially vibrant city. And using one tool is not enough. I think we all understand that. You need many other tools. You need a comprehensive approach. You need to have a vision of where you want to go. The idea in Norristown about using the preservation approach has been around since the 60s. Being a good bureaucrat, I keep records. I see here an ordinance proposed for Norristown of the kind that you're speaking about from 1964. What happened? That's a long time ago. But there were people then that were thinking that we should try to save the historic architecture, the historic character, the historic neighborhoods, the historic Main Street and downtown of Norristown, because, as was said before, that was one of its greatest assets. The other great asset, or the greater asset, are the people, the citizens of Norristown. So you have two great assets. The people that live here, work here, have a history of living here and working here, and the buildings themselves. 64. And here we are today, wondering whether or not Norristown should bite the bullet and establish some sort of regulation that would require people to come to the municipal building at some point in the process and discuss their project and go from there. That's what's at issue here. Should we establish a process by which people who are going to be doing some sort of change, we don't know how much you're going to regulate. Maybe you won't regulate color of a building, paint color of a building. Maybe you won't regulate the roofing material. Maybe you won't regulate this or that. Maybe you will. You haven't decided yet. This is still up in the air. But what you're thinking about is it would be useful to have the person who owns a home that could, at a wink of an eye, demolish it or change it irrevocably, to come before you, the citizens of Norristown, and discuss their project. And then you would give them some feedback through the Board of Historical Architectural Review, some feedback about what they're planning to do, and some guidance. And then council would make a decision. That's the idea behind it. Now, several cities, and how many exactly? Well, I have here, this was passed in 1964. Not passed, this was, the idea of an ordinance for Norristown was introduced in 1964. It was introduced by the Montgomery County Planning Commission as a concept, but obviously was never accepted. Now in 1961, the General Assembly, the Pennsylvania General Assembly, passed a law that is called the Historic District Act. So the Montgomery County Commission was ahead in thinking, now that the state has passed a law that authorizes municipalities, gives them the opportunity to have a historic district ordinance, let's introduce the idea for Norristown. Because in 1961, when the Historic District Act was passed, Bethlehem was the first city to pass an ordinance. Take a look at Bethlehem today. In fact, we're going to be doing, the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission and the Preservation Pennsylvania, the statewide nonprofit organization, is going to be doing, putting together an annual historic preservation conference there. And also we are doing the Old House Roadshow, which I'll talk about a few moments later. But take a look at that city. It's extraordinarily well preserved. But they've been at it since 1961. And they struggled, and they've had their ups and downs. They've gone through economic downturns. They lost the city of Bethlehem. And they lost the Bethlehem Steel, as you know. So they've had a lot of changes. Allentown has also established a historic district ordinance and so on, and many others have. All have struggled and been more or less successful, not just because of their Board of Historical Architectural Review, but because of the vision and the particular administrations that have been the leadership of those cities. You take the city of Harrisburg, where I live and work. I visited, when I was preservation officer for the city of Reading, I visited Harrisburg in the 70s. It looked pretty much like Norristown does today. Not great. The stock, the building stock was great, but in shabby condition. The main street of Harrisburg was dead. It was like a scene from an old Western. You know, everything but the tumbleweeds in the main square, you know? It was depressing. It's come back. It's extraordinary. Why has it come back? Not just because of historic preservation. That would be a lot. It's come back because you have a man like Mayor Reed and a staff and many community groups, civic groups, economic development corporations, and so on, that have all pulled together and helped to change the city in about 30 years. You go downtown today in Harrisburg, and that change just occurred about 3 or 4 years ago. In fact, I noticed it because I live in the city. I've always lived in the cities. And I plan to continue to doing so. I noticed that for the first time, I saw a phenomenal change. Instead of cars moving out of the city after 5 o'clock, they were going to the city. That was amazing. And the downtown now of Harrisburg has restaurants and stores and nightclubs, and there's activity. And you walk around at night, and it's alive. And people from their deadbeat suburbs and their boring malls and shopping centers are coming downtown to Harrisburg because, hey man, that's what's happening. It's the happening place. It can happen. It can be done. But preservation by itself won't do it. Of course not. And your point about, and I'm not using your words, but throwing an ordinance on the books, throwing an ordinance out and saying, okay, from now on, this is how it's going to be, that's not going to work either. It's a bigger picture, but still, preservation plays a very important role. I mean, Norristown is, look at Phoenixville. I've been involved in preservation for 25 years. So I have enough, distance now to see how long it takes to get things going. Phoenixville was having a hard time. Pottstown was having a hard time. And it's still struggling, but they've really made, I think, great headway. The changes are obvious. Something's going on in these cities that you have to investigate and understand why it isn't happening. Now, for the first time, I see before me hope. Why do I see hope? Because I see council people here, and I see women here that are on council. Let me tell you about women and historic preservation. Women and historic preservation. Women in America are the ones that have actually made the major changes in historic preservation. It was Pamela Sue Cunningham, for instance, that had the wherewithal to save Monticello, Thomas Jefferson's dwelling. It was another woman, Mrs. Littleton, who saved George Washington's domicile. It was a woman who changed around the whole concept of preservation from just saving a building as a historic museum, which these two women had done initially, to saving a neighborhood. And that was in Charleston. You go to Charleston, South Carolina, and you just wonder, well, wow. But wow, in 1931, it was a dump. And people were leaving Charleston, South Carolina, and planners from the city were saying the best thing to do in Charleston is to tear it down and start anew. That's what the planners were doing. And this woman had more sense. And she said, well, wait a minute. These are great buildings. These are great assets. Look at them. And let's try something else. And they did, and look at it today. But it's not to mean that the mayor of Charleston today isn't struggling and working hard, and somehow you pass a law and boom, everything is fine. No way. An ordinance won't change things. And you have to figure out what will. But I think you're on the right track. There's hope. Curb appeal. You were talking about curb appeal. Yeah, and the neighborhood appeal, and the city appeal. So you have a lot in front of you to deal with. But using preservation as a tool, as a marketing tool, is a good idea. The thing is, it has to be sold to the people that own the buildings. Who are the people that own the buildings? Do they have the same appreciation of the architecture? Or are they struggling like crazy to make a living and to make ends meet, and maybe don't have the time to think about the history of Norristown and the fact that the buildings were constructed by former immigrants, of which I am one. I'm not a former immigrant, I'm an immigrant now. You know, when I first came to this country, my initial, my mother came to this country, we came from France with $50 in our pockets, you know. And within a few weeks, fortunately, my mother got a job. And that's the way a lot of us come to this country. But our concern at that time certainly was just trying to survive, get a foot, get a stake and build on it. It takes a while for an immigrant to appreciate the history of the place that he or she is in. It takes a while to be able to read the built environment, the architecture, and to understand that what you're looking at represents different periods of history, different styles, different cultures, different ethnic groups. How many Irish, how many Italians, how many Slavs built this town, and so on. So we have to be able to communicate to the people that own the houses why it would be important to preserve some of its aspect, but we also have, as you indicated, Amy, we have to give them some incentives. We have to help them through facade improvement programs, through low-interest loans, through clean streets. I mean, there's nothing worse, for instance, than going to somebody and recommending that they preserve the historic architecture, and then, like certain cities, they don't enforce the building codes or the maintenance codes. You know, you go up to somebody and say, you really should preserve that, and next door to you is a house that's falling apart and has been falling apart for 25 years. I mean, that's a hard case to make. If you're going to have an ordinance, you better enforce it. If you have a zoning ordinance, and it's really called a zoning variance ordinance, don't be thinking about putting a preservation ordinance on the books, because it's just going to be another game. Don't do that. People are not stupid. So those are things I'm thinking about when you're talking about preservation and the ordinance and whatnot. What's tough is when you have a lot of absentee landlords. Not every absentee landlord is a slumlord. People often blame, typically when I was in the city of Reading, people immediately blamed the Prince Historic District decline on the Puerto Rican population that moved there. Like, it was the Puerto Ricans that created the problems. Everything was laid on them. They did it. They were before that, when I was reading the newspapers to do the history of Reading, everything was blamed on the Irish. You looked at the front page, and a lot of people committed crimes, but only Irish seemed to be getting in the papers. someone told me then that the reason they wanted to do preservation for the district was, to let, get rid of those people somehow. It turns out that immigrants are the ones that saved these neighborhoods, actually. That people who left the neighborhood, left the houses poorly maintained, didn't put the money in it, and then split to the suburbs or whatever. And so the new immigrants come in, and then people point to them and say, look at the way they maintain those houses. Isn't that a shame? Why? I mean, look, let's get things straight here. It's not the way it is. Don't blame the new immigrant for the condition that you yourselves have created. Preservation is not going to solve that. You're going to have to think preservation as a good tool. But how do you convince when there are slumlords, how do you convince those people that they should put money in their buildings? If you go, for instance, if you have the city, and don't blame the building inspectors either. Don't bill the building inspectors for not enforcing the building or maintenance codes when they do, they get pulled on the carpet for enforcing the ordinance. Like I used to be pulled on the carpet in Reading. But I defied that. I defied that pressure. Don't do that. Don't have somebody who owns 3 or 4, 6 or 7, homes or apartment houses, whatever, call one of the council people and complain that they're being picked on. Because you're not going to, preservation and putting the ordinance in is not going to take care of that part. You got to take care of that. So, I think about that. I think about that before I start going ahead and putting an ordinance on the books. I mean, what kind of commitment are you going to have behind it? How many exceptions are you going to make because people complain? Are you going to be consistent? Are you going to be fair? Are you going to give incentives? These are the things I think that have to be thought about. I have seen success stories, definitely. But I don't anymore go around like I'm a preacher saying preservation is the answer for everything. I'm not selling an elixir. I'm not selling a cure-all. I'm enthusiastic, even after 25 years, that it is a very workable, very useful tool in the right hands. People say to me, well, are you going to talk about how it improves property values? I mean, it does, right? Well, a lot of things improve property values, and that could be one of them. But it's not a surefire thing. But certainly, it can't hurt if the ordinance is not overly restrictive and is consistently and fairly and intelligently administered. You have to have that. You can't have arbitrariness. Oh, it's okay for you to do it, not. It's not a people like sitting down and saying, oh, I think this is nice or beautiful. It's got to be consistent. It's got to be intelligent. It's got to be based on facts. Can it help? Can it help property values? I think so. I mean, I've seen neighborhoods, where you a neighborhood that has an ordinance that's been enforced properly, and a neighborhood that doesn't have it, and over a while you see positive changes. But look, you're not going to see it in 2 years. You're not going to see it in 5 years. You're not going to see it necessarily in 10 years. So you have to ask yourself, what my old boss, Earl Haight, used to say when I worked for the cable company and I was a cable installer. He'd come up to me and he'd say, hey, Frog, what about the long haul? And he was a bald-headed guy with a cigar. Now I'm the bald-headed guy. Hey, Frog, what about the long haul? And you have to think about that. I think it can work. I've seen it work. And I've seen it in cases where it doesn't work or where it's stymied. Reading is a perfect example. Reading was very aggressive in historic preservation. Reading, through the investment tax credit project, through the facade improvement program, through many other things, was very aggressive in preservation, and you could see positive changes. And I think you still can. I think it's helped certain neighborhoods tremendously to sustain them, to keep them alive and fairly well, considering all the impact that has happened. You can't blame Norristown for national and statewide policies. You can't just look and say it's Norristown's fault. I mean, when you look at all the development outside and all the malls and all that stuff going out there, and the racism and all that other stuff that's been going on all these years, and some of the brain drain that might have happened too, you can't just blame Norristown for where it's at today. It's also outside in all the policies that have occurred. But now is the time for Norristown to get its act together, finally, and show, because I think it's beautifully placed myself. Look, it's close to Philadelphia. You've got a train station. Does it stop here? You've got a train that stops here. The houses are affordable. You're going to have a district. It's going to start turning around. People are going to say, hey, I can get on a train, work in Philadelphia, work outside of Philly. I can invest in this house. I can have a beautiful house, a lot of space, and so on. I mean, this can happen. This builds up. You've got to promote yourself. You've got to be proud of yourself. And you have to continue the fight all the time and the promotion all the time. It's a campaign. It's a campaign that lasts for years. All right, that's enough.
Okay, now we're going to take a 5-minute break. We're going to go into questions and answers, and I might as well mention this now before we start that. For the cable, they requested that there be a brief, say a second pause between me. First off, a special thanks to the Norristown School District, and Brian here is our cameraman that they sent down for us today. He's been doing a wonderful job. And before we go into our question and answer period, I want to announce our next forum, which will be on a topic that has stirred many of emotions in many residents in the borough of Norristown, and that has to do with Norristown State Hospital. We're still bouncing around on a set date. At this point, we originally had planned it for the 18th of May. Unfortunately, that conflicts with some events with the Preservation Society. The weekend after that, unfortunately or fortunately, is the holiday. Weekend after that is the Family Day. Sure. The weekend after that, we have some graduation of some of our members. So, at this point, it looks like it may be May 11th. If there's a change on that, we'll notify you, and we will be putting out advertisements in advance. Watch your cable channel. We will be advertising there, and hopefully in what's happening in the Times Herald. And usually it does make it on Norristown.com if any of you are religious observers of the Norristown.com world. Okay, speakers for that and the subject matter will be the Norristown State Hospital past, present, and future. Obviously, we don't know what the future is yet, but there are some different ideas that are being bounced around. One of the keynote speakers for that will be Richard McDonough. He is noted for a revitalization alternate program that he presented at the same time that the county had the, what is it, Shapiro? Abel Shapiro, one which was the one that was actually adopted by the borough. Some many ingenious ideas. And he's also just finished up a fairly impromptu 3-part seminar that was held on Saturdays and Friday evenings, which is, I believe, had the attention of many of our councilwomen. Also present at this next forum will be Penny Dunyan, who is the head of the Citizens Advisory Committee to the Norristown State Hospital. So, Now we're going to go on to questions and answers, and again, a brief presentation. I will point to whoever, which time the camera will shift your direction, and then back to whoever will be answering, so we'll have the same momentary pause in between. So, for your questions. Yes, sir.
Does anybody in your panel know about Haddonfield, New Jersey, and their success rate on keeping a historical town? Or anybody in the panel know anything about Haddonfield, New Jersey?
Nope.
Right
Been
next
there.
to Camden?
Yes, actually, I do know something about that. Several years ago, when the idea of establishing a harbor was first begun to be discussed in preservation ranks, we asked a woman from Haddonfield to come and give us an address. And it was a very interesting story. I believe that they actually got their ordinance passed over the objections of many of the city fathers by a plebiscite. They actually had they voted a request for a plebiscite, enough people signed it, and it was overwhelmingly passed. And I think, looking at Haddonfield today, you can see the results. It really has improved, I think, the looks of the town. And Haddonfield, at one time, was afraid that they were going to be overrun by the slum conditions that had come over Camden nearby. But Haddonfield is beautiful today. It has a lot of historic architecture. It's quite nice. In fact, we have a board member who previously lived in Haddonfield. She's always singing the praises of Haddonfield. Okay.
Yes, sir.
There are issues which are hard in terms of property rights. There can be conflicts there. That's one issue that I want to ask about to be addressed, or at least considered in the development of the ordinance. And then also, inevitably, the type of activity that we're talking about will lead to what was at one time called gentrification and possibly displacement. I mean, we spoke about, I know in my situation, I recently purchased a house in Norristown from an elderly person who was really dependent on the sale of the house to finance or annuitize their retirement. There may be situations where elderly people or longstanding residents of the town might not be able to work with the HARB in terms of maintaining their properties, up to the standards that will be created by the ordinance. And then also there could be economic pressure on them as things happen with tax rates and things like that. At least from my experience historically, these types of things happen. Is that part of the consideration?
I'd like to address that. As I said earlier, I think when a municipality considers enacting a historic district ordinance, these two issues should be something that they ought to think about. The role of the Board of Historical Architectural Review, the members of that board are made up of, by law, required to be made up of an architect, registered architect, building inspector, a licensed real estate broker, and others on that board that have some understanding of housing, old house technology, and history preservation, and so on. Their role is to take a look at what's being proposed in the change that's being proposed and make some recommendations about it, either to approve the change, in other words, to recommend approval for a permit, or to come up with some sort of solution that is workable for the owner of the property and still maintains the general historic character of that property and of the district. Now, the issue that you bring out about a person not being able to come up with the demands of the recommendations of the board. My experience with over 80 municipalities that enforce these ordinances is that a compromise is almost always found that is generally acceptable to both parties. whether there's a Board of Historical Architectural Review or not, whether there's an ordinance or not, a person still has to maintain their property. So even if a property owner, even if there's not a historic district ordinance, a person is required to maintain their property. So having a board of review doesn't necessarily equate that it's going to make that more difficult for the owner. And I think Amy might herself, from her experience and my own experience in Reading, actually we often find solutions to maintenance problems and repair problems that are less expensive than what is being proposed by sometimes either contractors that are unscrupulous or that are not knowledgeable. So as a perfect example is the replacement window scan. Someone could come up to an elderly homeowner and say, look, see how much energy loss you're suffering in your house. And I have the answer for you. Replace all those windows. And I remember in the Prince Historic District, this man was in his 80s and owned a end-of-row house. And it was being proposed to him that he would save X amount of money by replacing all these windows. The point is, though, it was going to cost him about $15,000 to $17,000 to replace all the windows. Unless this guy was going to live to be like Methuselah. It was not a cost-effective, solution. So the board is there really as an advocate for the property owner. That's really, I think, one of its main purposes. What do you think?
Oh, I very much agree. Or even, the replacement windows, of course, is a big issue, and materials change, and replacement windows that are going in now just aren't comparable to what was existing there. Once you've lost it, you've lost it. One of the things I recommend to people, and possibly looking into maintaining your original wood window and installing a storm window on the exterior. Storm windows can have thinner sashes and that type of thing, and storm windows could always be removed without doing any damage or destroying the original architectural or historical fabric. So that's yes.
I'd like to comment on that too, and a couple of points. First of all, about the elderly annuity problem. One of the problems we've had in Norristown is that while property values all around Norristown have risen, those in Norristown have not. So you do have to feel sorry for any elderly people who have banked their retirement to their nursing home care on the value of their house when they sell it if they live in Norristown, because it just has not risen. And since the HARB actions would really only be triggered upon application for a building permit, generally speaking, this is the case, it's only when people are ready to spend money, and presumably have the money to spend, that the entire issue would come up. And although some people might object, that's a problem, people let their places go. Generally speaking, I think a HARB can help people save money. A lot of the things that are done to houses that are very destructive, historically and architecturally and aesthetically destructive, are really a waste of money. They're also financially destructive. Now, right now, I don't think we have any window guys going around, other than the county weatherization program guys, but we do have stucco guys going around. And they come to an old guy or an old lady, typically, and give her a high-pressure sales pitch, and tell her, oh, you're going to have to point this house. It's going to cost a lot of money. We can stucco this whole house, and it won't have to be stuccoed ever again, or pointed ever again. But it costs more to stucco it than to point it, and she's ruined the value of her house, both aesthetically and financially. And I also see just the existence of the HARB as perhaps curbing the appetite for certain agencies to demand change in the historic fabric of the town. I've heard stories that HUD inspectors demand aluminum siding, or we have a problem in Norristown with the, we originally had all brick sidewalks. A great many of them have been replaced The buildings department tells people that if they take up more than a certain percentage of their sidewalk, the entire sidewalk has to be replaced with concrete. And you know, it's very easy for a homeowner to get down on his hands and knees and take up a few bricks and put a sewer line under or whatever and put it back himself. I'm a great proponent of do-it-yourself work. I think it's typically better done than the contractors do today.
Not if you had me doing it.
So, I think that a HARB, although in some cases it costs more for materials, I think in many cases the HARB actually could save people money. And I would also like to see the architect on the HARB to offer some advice to homeowners, which they normally would have to pay for and would never dream of spending money for.
Okay, my name is Joe Wyden, the homeowners association. I came in a little late, Bill Ward was talking, and I may have missed it, but I want to know, I discovered last Friday, that the borough has got a contract with a local architectural firm to do a Norristown design guide, which seems like it could fit very well into the concept of the HARP, setting up standards and some means presumably enforcing it. Has anyone had a chance, have you or Doug Seiler had a chance to look over and see if this is relevant to our HARP proposal? Because if it is, I spoke with the borough planning department and asked for copies to be made available. I'm going to pick them up early next week, and I would make this, share this, if this is a useful document, and could be the beginning of a HARP design guide.
Joel, where did you get that from again?
I attended last Friday. Several of our
This
borough
is part of
council
the
building
design
entities was
improvements?
here, several other community members. Doug couldn't make it, but you have had a chance, or you did get a copy of this, and I hope you'll be looking over it. I'd like to see this. It seems to me this could be the tool for moving into the HARP. I don't know what Michelle and Fever has had a chance to look over or
Okay,
watched.
Michelle, do you have a
Any thoughts or
comment?
comments on this proposal? I will be making copies available if it is useful. Go ahead.
Thank you, Joel.
One of the things that I think we have to be so careful about is that we don't want to necessarily impose our own sense of values on what we think is aesthetically pleasing on others. You know, like somebody come around and look at me and say, this guy's wearing a green pair of pants with a pink shirt. I mean, like, this is ugly. That's like a value judgment. One thing about preservation is it's not whether it's ugly or not ugly. It's really if the intent has to be clear. If the intent is to preserve the historic character of the neighborhood or for district or the house, building, the issue is are the changes being proposed appropriate, architecturally appropriate? Not it's nice or it's not nice, or I like it or I don't like it. That's a lot different. So we have to be very careful when we have board members of HARBs not to impose their own personal likes and dislikes on other people. But on the other end, on the other side of that, we have to convince people to value maintaining the historic character. And just passing an ordinance is not going to do it. There has to be a lot more of an effort to communicate the importance of maintaining that historic character. I mean, you don't have to be convinced. You already know it's important. But how do you convince someone who has never really looked even at a building or even seen a building in the way that we do? I mean, you'd have to convince me that preserving a I don't even know what I'm talking about here, 62 Camaro, it may not even been built in 62 for all I know, is, you know, important. I mean, I could give a darn. Darn is okay, right, for TV. It's okay for cable. Anyway. So, I mean, we have a lot of work to do with that, in that regard of trying to communicate the importance of maintaining historic character. I mean, that's not an easy thing to do.
Marge?
Yes, if I can direct my question to Amy. Is there funding available for staff members or perhaps low-income homeowners and business owners that end up being in a HARB and for education programs?
Generally, monies that the HARB may, well, for instance, we do provide funding for our HARB members to attend conferences. That generally, I believe, comes out of our CDBG funding from the federal government. But otherwise, it's very limited.
There is a program called the Certified Local Government Program. It's a national park program which municipalities are eligible for, like the city of Reading has that status of a certified local government program. And you can, through that program, a municipality can apply for grants to do brochures, design guidelines, and also provide some staffing funding. The city of Lancaster, Bethlehem, the city of Philadelphia, many boroughs and townships have that status, that certified local government status, and have used grant funding. It's a 60-40 match, 60 from the state cash and 40 either cash or in kind from the municipality. So it is really very important to try to have a professional preservation person, planner, or consultant to assist the board and assist the public and council, and that's available through the CLG program. And we administer that through our office.
Marge?
Amy, are you a full-time staff member?
Yes, I'm a full-time staff member. Yes, and because I monitor, or my salary comes out of the CDBG funding as well, and part of the reason is I monitor the facade improvement program, which is funded by that. So yes, but I am full-time.
I wanted to ask Amy, how can you afford your Mercedes?
Richard?
The Pennsylvania row house, 2 or 3 story, was a wonderful way to live in the last half of the 19th century. It was much better than the tenements of New York or even the 3-deckers of Boston. But in those days, most people walked to work or maybe later took the streetcar. Now, in today's world, you've got to have space for 2 cars. I'm just wondering, what is the role of selective clearance? I'm not talking about when I started planning urban renewal was then slum clearance, but there are issues in Norristown where the houses are so bad and there's no space unless you could clear it out. If you can't have off-street parking, does that mean if the house is bad, particularly, maybe that has to go in a selective way? I've often urged in Norristown make almost a house-by-house study of the critical areas as to what should be preserved and what might be maybe better off. All things, there's particularly a controversy right now on what is it, Spruce or Elm Street, I guess. I don't know, but what is the role then if a harbor is created, and not for a harbor, but housing policy in general? What is the role of selective clearance in an area where most you want to preserve, but maybe you've got to have off-street parking? If you don't have that, and it's not big enough, maybe it's just not marketable to the way people want to live today.
I'm not sure if that's really a subject for...
Well, I would like to answer this to some degree.
Well, it does involve, it involves more than historic preservation, but it's a housing.
Almost every historic street in Norristown has an alley behind it.
Well, that's great.
That means it has access to the backyard for parking. If the house is a single-family house, and most of the houses in the historic district are quite small, and they are single-family houses, even if they're let out, then there's room in the rear for 2 cars. And then there should be room in the front for 2 more cars. So even a 4-family car should have enough parking space. It's really not necessary to clear every other house or whole blocks
I
for
don't
parking.
contest that. No?
Michelle?
I have an opinion about everything, so. But I think that's a very good point you're making about parking. I think we have to, if we want to attract, if we want to retain, and if we want to attract property owners, those of us that care about our cars, I exclude myself. are concerned about the damage to the car, or being able to find a parking space, or being able to get the groceries out and without having somebody honking at you in the street. I've lived in these towns, so I know what that's like. So selective clearance for parking is not a stupid idea, but I think you have to have, again, a very comprehensive plan, an understanding of how to do it, and how to do it in such a way as to still maintain the historic character, generally, of the neighborhood. And I think that's valid. One ought to address those issues. It's no good saying there's enough parking if the parking is not adequate to somebody who owns a fairly new model car and wants to put some money in a house, and then you turn around and don't provide some of these amenities. Then you have the zoning issue as far as parking in the rear or in the front. In the rear of the property where the alleys are, you may be limited by zoning, and you may be required, you might not be able to have parking. So, I mean, I think that's a valid thing. You have to find some intelligent, comprehensive way of dealing with it.
Doug?
I just want to make a couple comments. Discussion's been great this morning. I appreciate it. As far as I'm an architect. I've sat for clients working on projects and come before HARBs, come before Historical Architecture Review Boards. An interesting recent one was in Philadelphia for a building that was an 1890s building, had important interiors by Frank Furness, and it had a postmodern stage house addition on the back. It was bare concrete block, had its proportions were kind of goofy, and we came before the HARB because A, it was in the Center City Residence District, and it was individually listed on the city register. I considered that dialogue with the HARB, like I have probably on maybe the 6 or 7 other times I've been before HARBs, most of the time in Philly, been in a couple other towns as well. I considered it an asset. That they were working with the project, with the owner. Whenever I come before a board like that, you have all of a sudden 6 smart, fresh minds who are looking at your project new. And we addressed the owner's desire to stucco this bare concrete block, the general consensus on Delancey Street that this building was an eyesore, and also with the understanding that while postmodernism isn't in fashion right now, it has its place in architectural history. So it was a very interesting dialogue that went on this building, and we did stucco the building. We did it in a way to keep proportions and certain elements. It was not something that drove the cost up, and it did require me to change some drawings. I wasn't offended by it. It did cause us, the staff, it's similar to how it is in Reading. When you come before a board in Philadelphia, certain things the staff can review, and they can just say, for instance, oh, they have certain things, that they're able to just comment on. This issue required us to come before the board. The other character or personality on the board that you didn't mention in yours, Amy, is they also had a structural engineer as a requirement on Philadelphia's board. But what's interesting is you sit in a room with 7 people who have knowledge in buildings, and in Norristown's case, I see it all the time where this borough could benefit immensely from it. Just in driving to this session this morning, there's a street, I forget what it is, that I cut over, and it's got a block that's classic, workers' housing, where this block, for some reason, somebody's gone in there and painted about half the houses red, and then gone in with white paint and painted the brick joints. Massive amount of labor to do that. So somebody's caught on that that's an okay thing to do on this street. I think, frankly, like the window replacement people, if you came before a board of people to know a little bit about building and know a little bit about this city, and you're presenting to them, I want to paint my brick red and my joints white, you talk about A, the cost, it's massively labor, it doesn't last so long, looks awful, permanently damaged brick.
It looks awful to you.
Oh, that's right.
To me,
There
it
you
looks
go.
beautiful. Yeah, so we're not gonna put you on that board.
Right. I'm not sure I want to, but in any event, so I just wanted to say that I consider the Harb, as someone who sat in front of them, as a real asset to the project, no question in my mind. The other thing I want to just mention is that as a building owner, the reason why I think a building owner wants a Harb in their community is because if I'm going to put $100,000 or $50,000 or $20,000 into my building, I'd like to have some assurance that the rest of my neighborhood is not under siege, that somebody's going to put, you know, pressure-treated wood or rip, like when you move to a neighborhood, you move for why it looks or your perception. But if you move in there and somebody tears all the porches off across the street, or does any number of things that damage the appearance of it, it affects your property values and it affects your feelings about why you're there. So I think Harbs preserve, I think a Harb encourages people to invest in their property because they have some assurance that that their investment will be reasonably protected. Maybe that's not the right word, but that's I think that's an aspect. And then just the last thing, Michelle, perhaps you might know this. When I look around this region, I see Pottstown, Phoenixville, Ambler, Media, Westchester, Doylestown, Ardmore, Wayne. You almost can't, Narberth, you almost can't list a sort of a group that has a downtown sort of Main Street and assemblage of buildings that doesn't have some kind of municipal review of what happens to these towns. I was wondering, statistically, my sense is Norristown is unusual in that regard, but is there any like hard numbers for like the numbers of Harbs in Pennsylvania or like the percentages of certain sizes communities? Like how unusual is Norristown for not having a Harb?
Well, it's the gas leak that in Norristown that has created. I'm just kidding, of course. That's what my old boss Earl Haight used to say about Reading. You know, there are about 80 or so municipalities in Pennsylvania that have established a historic district ordinance authorized under the Historic District Act, about 80. And they protect about 103 municipalities, 103 districts. Then beyond that, there's also using the municipality's planning code and using zoning under that to also regulate and protect historic resources. And there are about 200 of those municipalities. And that's, so, you know, we're talking about 325 more or less municipalities doing some sort of protection of historic resources. But that's out of 2,568 municipalities. So it's a fairly small portion. So is Norristown unusual in not having gone ahead with a historic district ordinance or some sort of regulation to protect its historic resources? I can't say because there are many third-class cities that haven't done it, and so there are more that haven't done it than have. So in that sense, it's not unusual. Because you have to have several factors coming together to make it possible and make it successful. And I think some of those factors I might have mentioned earlier.
Doug, a further comment to your, I think I know those houses you're talking about. Without dropping names, I think the situation was they had salmon brick and there was deterioration of the brick. He didn't want a stucco. So what he did some spot repairs and stuck one underneath and then painted the brick look. So I guess,
You know, when your brick's damaged, you always have a problem on your hands, no
yes,
question.
yes.
I wanted to address that issue of gentrification, which has come up a couple of times now. I think Danny mentioned it earlier. I was surprised to see recently, I guess I always, in the past, just accepted the line that gentrification means long-term residents having to move out. But a recent study has shown that is not actually the case. The gentrification in the neighborhood apparently causes long-term residents to stay longer rather than forcing them to move out. Now, I don't really know what the details of this all are, but I don't think we can use just the word gentrification to imply that improving a neighborhood either aesthetically or financially is bad.
Mary Ellen?
Amy, I wanted to ask you, one of the things that you had mentioned when Reddington took on the harp was that council retained their decision on demolition, and that's what I wanted to find out is when you have a program like HARP established in a community, for example with Reading, how has Reading been able to stop any demolition of historical buildings? And because, you know, right now we're in the process of fighting one now, and my curiosity is that, you know, you've got the owner who owns this building, he feels that he can do anything he wants with this building, but yet you have a community that wants to keep the beauty there that's established.
In my experience so far, yes and no. The first example, we had quite a large mansion on North Fifth Street, which Fifth Street is one of the main streets running through Reading. And a funeral director has his funeral business right adjacent to it, and he owned the site, and he wanted to demolish the mansion, and it was one of the last mansions located close to our downtown business district, and he wanted to demolish for parking. And of course, yeah, of course the board denied it, and he went to city council, and city council tends to look at things more on the side of business owner, and well, we're going to lose his business. And his argument, of course, was there's other funeral homes in the city that have parking, whether, you know, across the street, or they probably have demolished houses for that. But you know, he was going to lose business, so council granted him, approved his demolition of his building. We had another right on Penn Street, which is the main street running through through our downtown. There in the 400 block, there is a group of buildings that are just in deplorable condition. They were, it was originally a department store and several stores alongside of it. And one of the buildings still retains an edifice that goes back to the 1800s, I believe. And the argument there was we have to save this building, and the structure has changed over time, and now it has more of a modern facade, but still it's architecturally significant. And we kind of compromised and bargained to retain this one building and allow the other buildings, which have been significantly altered, to be demolished. As of yet, they're not demolished because then the issue is financing the demolition. So, but council then again approved the demolition of this group of buildings.
So having a harm really is no guarantee that
Well,
you can save the structure or not.
I think you all use the term HARB. Drop that for a moment and use the term Historic District Ordinance.
Right.
The HARB is a part of the process. Is a board appointed by council to oversee, to review the projects. So the point is that whether it's under zoning, well, let's just use the Historic District Act. Under the Historic District Act, council has the last say in regards to issuing permits for demolition, new construction, alterations, and so on. If council has the will, it can deny a permit. That's the answer. Whether it always denies a demolition permit for demolition, no, it doesn't always. Council has to weigh various factors. But if the overall purpose is to preserve the historic character of the district, and council buys into that idea, then it will be very hesitant to issue a permit for demolition because it's counter to the whole intent of the ordinance, which is to preserve the historic district. In the case of what Amy was talking about, when in 1979, I think it was, or 78, 79, when the ordinance was passed, the historic district ordinance was passed in Reading, the same gentleman, whose name I will not mention, Renninger, Henninger, thank you, Henninger, I will not mention his name. Mr. Henninger then had a building that he wanted to demolish also for parking, which would create 6 parking spaces. He said he had residents in it, it was in perfect shape, there was a business downstairs, and he wanted to demolish it to create 6 parking spaces because he said he needed that for his funeral home. And that was the first big issue that council was faced with. And after several meetings and hearings and so on, finally council relented and the building came down. Again, Mr. Renninger came back years later, and the big irony about Mr. Renninger is that he promotes his funeral business as being in the Callow Hill Historic District. Eventually, it would probably be the Callow Hill parking lot Renninger District at the rate that he's going, because there's never enough parking. But so you see, it really depends on the will of council. And I think this gentleman, who's a former planner, has a good point. Selective, you have to be selective about what you demolish. But if every property owner or merchant would ask for a parking, then you'd really have a helter-skelter kind of a situation, which I don't think would be very helpful.
Yes, sir.
Of the historic district that's noted on the map there on the easel, of the properties that are within that district, does anyone have a handle on the proportion of rental properties versus properties that are owned by homeowners or business owners? That's
I think I
one.
can probably answer that for you.
Okay, and then number 2, maybe Amy can answer this. Does the creation of a historic district promote the idea of business ownership, home ownership within those districts over the years, and move away from investment properties and rental properties as this historic district develops? Those are my 2 questions.
Well, the first one, I think the answer is going to be that mostly the rental and or business owners. As the second, you asked for the board.
I don't know if I can answer.
Whether or not the passage of a historic district ordinance will eventually create a situation where you have fewer absentee landlord and more home. I think it does, but it's a long, long process. I mean, it's not 5 years, it's not 10 years. It's a long.
That's something that was experienced in Reading, for instance. Did you see that process developing, moving away from investment properties and absentee landlords?
Sure,
to
that's what does happen.
individual ownership?
Yeah, it does happen, but it takes a long time.
And we have other things in place, actually. We have a housing program, where multiple apartment units where it was once a single family unit is being returned to a single family unit. And some of this is occurring throughout the city, but it is occurring in the historic districts. So, yeah, that's definitely an intent citywide, not just in the historic districts.
Yes, sir.
Yes, I truly believe that this, maintaining the historical character will definitely be, requires money and will be tied into the economy of the town. I'm a newcomer. I've been living in Norristown for 6 months. When you look at Norristown and around Norristown, Conshohocken is booming. Maniac is booming. We got the big drug companies. Everywhere is booming except Norristown, enclave. My question is why? Now, I did get a lot of answers from older people who have been investing in town. And that's not an answer that I like very much, but I would like to get yours.
Well, I don't think this is probably the topic of our discussion here, and certainly people that are, well, Michelle, I'm sure you probably can answer this correctly since it's appropriate for this town, but I guess Bill or Michael, you guys want to?
Well, I think partly it's just because the town does look so vast. You know, there's a long history in Norristown of various governmental problems. And they probably do have something to do with it. But typically when people are looking at a property to buy, and the number of people looking, the number of people willing to buy is largely what determines the price of real estate. They aren't really familiar, if they're from outside town, they're not really familiar with this long history. They just look at the place and it looks bad. And it needs to look better. It's as simple as that.
Yeah, there are a lot of, I mean, there are many factors that create a situation that we see here today in Norristown. Some of them are national policies, some are state policies, others have to do with cultural trends, migration and immigration. It's very complex. I mean, it's a very complex issue, which is thousands of books and studies have been done on this subject. But ultimately, I think that Norristown can turn itself around in spite of a lot of difficulties. And I think one of them, I think, is right. If the appearance of the town itself comes around, but for appearance, you need to invest money. But even cleaning the streets properly is a big deal. You know, I mean, if the streets are clean and if there's a sense of safety, and that goes a long way. And then once that's there, then people begin to invest in their houses. And as Mayor Reed has said about Harrisburg, you can't disassociate the school district from the city. And people move also a lot of times or move out due to the school district. And until those issues are faced, you can't really solve a lot of the problems. So I think gentrification is a long way from happening in Norristown.
Okay, everyone, I've just been told we have to wrap this up. Thank you all for coming. Hopefully this has stirred up enough thinking that we can follow through with this in more detail. Again, there will be another meeting on Tuesday. Please keep in mind this whole process we're addressing here, we're talking about facades. So let's not all get frightened that the whole town is going to be turned upside down because of a horror possibly coming into town. And obviously, there's many steps associated with it. First, we're going to have to create it. We're going to have to make sure it's enforced, and we're going to have to follow through. You got to take the first step if we're going to get anywhere. Thank you again, everyone, for coming in. Hopefully, we'll see you sometime in May for our next forum of the State Hospital.